Hi, everybody. I just want to welcome you to our Community for Care Spirit Council co-sponsored program on implicit bias tonight. I am very happy to see you all here tonight. I think it is such an important conversation for us to have here in Simsbury, and I think it has to start somewhere, and I say it starts here. So tonight, we are very pleased to have a licensed therapist and a board member from True Colors, Shane Scott. And he is going to lead us through this discussion. He has a presentation, but will also be available for questions, and I would encourage you to participate in the discussion. That's why we're here, and I'm sure Shane is open to that also.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks.
And I'll turn it over to Shane.
Hello. Oh, wow. Hey. Hello. So thank you. I'm really happy to be here. I hate the echo part of this, but we'll make it work. Super happy to be here. It's probably good that we use this because I talk really low. I don't know if there's a way to not have feedback or not, but is that why you're looking at me like that? Hold on. Yeah, that would probably help. I don't. Oh, where'd our friends go? Do you know how to turn the speakers off? Okay. Is that, hey, oh, nope, now it's like, yeah. now it's off completely. Yeah, it's off completely.
Yeah, it's on, but it's live for recording.
Okay.
So what you want to, do you want the power back?
I was just wondering about I don't know. Yeah. You can't see, okay. Hello. I think that's better, right?
Okay.
Does that sound better? Okay. Is that good? Okay. They wanted me to sit over there, but this is for you, so we'll make it work. Okay. So, yeah, so I'm really hoping that we can get into a really open discussion about bias and what that means. And I know that from what I understand that there's been some challenges here in your town, and we really want to be able to start that dialogue, and starting with the people in this room. And what I prepared today was, I'll figure this microphone thing out, I promise. So what I prepared today was more of a presentation on bias, but also some information about working with the LGBT community. That's primarily what we do at True Colors. So what I think we're going to start with is just really talking about bias, and I hope that we're all comfortable enough to share with each other what our thoughts are. Yeah, so to share with each other what our thoughts are about and our experiences, and to really get into a dialogue to create some movement. So I have some stuff prepared, and I'm hoping that I can engage some of you folks to start talking about this. So it's something that I see all the time, and I think my work as a social worker and a therapist has really allowed me to understand like some of the stuff that we all do unintentionally most of the time, and that stuff that we think, and our judgments and parts of who we are that we don't think of regularly, and how they impact other people. So so I think, my therapist hat is not on tonight, so I won't be doing therapy with any of you, which is probably not what you want. So so we'll definitely dive into things and talk a little bit more. So I will start with just an idea about just to talk about what is bias, right? So does anyone have a definition that they want to share? Anyone think of anything? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Good. I saw a hand. Yeah.
Is that preference or prejudice against something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and usually in favor of someone or something else, right? So, absolutely. And it is really, yeah, so that's exactly what I have as well. So one thing, person, or group compared to another, usually in a way that is considered to be discriminatory in some pattern or shape. So it's really oftentimes we're unaware of them, right? We're unaware of the biases and the things that we have going on up here sometimes. And I think through my work in this field and working with people, I've learned that, and I was just talking about this a few minutes ago, but I think if you think about our experience as human beings, we naturally judge everyone and everything, right? So we go throughout our day and we're judging how the weather is terrible and how we don't like our job and our boss made us upset and I don't want to go to work today, and and there's all these thoughts and judgments that that come to us like probably 100 times a day, right? So it's not a matter of not judging, not being judgmental. It's about really being self-aware of what it is that you have a bias of, right? And being aware of like that sometimes we may even have biases and judgments that go against our values and what we believe in. But so it's really having that honest conversation with yourself and the people around you of what is it that you're holding on to and what beliefs are holding you back in some way, right? So it's important to be aware of our values and morals and what those look like, but also is there discrepancies in those two parts of our life, right? Are what we believe and what we are putting out into the world, is that matching what our actions are and our thoughts and our behavior? Okay, so I guess I'll start with a question and hopefully we can continue with some dialogue with this. So how does bias show up in your community on a daily basis? Or how have you seen it come up? Yeah.
Maybe naturally occurring. We live in a rather homogeneous community.
We may ask people to use the mics just so we're aware. So.
I think that because we live in a somewhat homogeneous community,
Okay.
we tend to get used to seeing the same things around us every day. Sometimes I tell my kids we live in the bubble because we're all very happy in our bubble. And things that are unfamiliar to us tend to provoke a reaction. A lot of times it is couched in terms like safety and health and all these things, but what we're really saying is we're afraid of something that's not what we're used to seeing every day.
Mm-hmm. So almost like a fear. There's a fear sometimes that things are outside of the normal routine.
For me personally, I'm sure
Yeah.
other people have different perceptions of what that looks like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good.
So I think it shows up in other ways, like, we're used to doing things the same way. Okay, so not being open to change, not being open to, and change can come in a lot of different ways. It can come in, the way that we structurally do things. It can be in, leadership. It can be in, supporting of one group versus another. So I think it's just sometimes not being open to change. And the bubble effect is here. It's definitely here.
The bubble effect of
the bubble effect is here.
Well, I think even if you think about the geographic location, right? So if you think about this area where Simsbury and Avon and Farmington, so if you think about the location and how it is a little bit further away from things, it's a little bit remote. Yeah, there's still things there, and you have access to things, but there is a little bit of a bubble feel because of that, and people often describe like Simsbury being so far away, and and so there is a little bit of this idea, and maybe this I don't want to say discrimination, but there's this idea that like that there's a misperception of what the community is like out here, right? And so if you think about, and it happens with a lot of the more affluent towns in Connecticut, you think about like, I live in West Hartford, so when I tell people that, they're like, oh, you're bougie, and and, and I'm like, I am not. So there's this idea that there's a bias with that, like that if you live in certain towns that you were given certain opportunities and there's certain expectations that go along with that, and that's not always true, right? So I grew up in Brooklyn, Connecticut, which most people are not aware that there is a Brooklyn, Connecticut, but it's, an hour from here, 7,000 people. There's not a high school because they don't have enough kids. So there's regional schools out there. So that's a far cry from West Hartford, right? So so because I can fit in there, there's a bias that I must be privileged and had these things given to me or these opportunities that I have, but that's not the case, right? So it's a yeah.
By us saying the town in which we live, sometimes that happens.
Yeah. Yep.
Just by us saying,
Absolutely. Yeah.
not even getting to know the person is, that person lives in Hartford.
Right.
Okay, so they live in Hartford.
Yeah. Yeah.
What does that really mean?
Right. Yeah. Well, and that really is so a form of a bias too, because it's like, all right, well, you're making an opinion or a sort of a discriminatory and judgmental comment or assumption. Thank you. I heard that. Assumption about someone, where they come from based on where they live. So, so if there's a young person of color that lives in Hartford, then they're probably not doing well, or they're, or there's a certain idea about their future and what they must do there and what they're going to do. So even if you drive from, I always use the example, if you drive from like the West End, if you drive from like, let's say Farmington Ave in the Hartford, West End of Hartford, and you keep going on Farmington Ave, you can literally feel the difference as you get closer to the center. And then you have a KFC on one end of Farmington Ave, and then you go about a mile or two down the road and you have Crate and Barrel, right? So, whoa, sorry. This microphone is so real. It's like, okay. So it's such a difference. And I think that's one of the big things that we have to really be honest about in Connecticut, is that there's a lot of inequity. There's a lot of disparity. There's a lot of differences in terms of where people come from. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say also, before you meet people or you even are introduced to a town, you might be introduced to the town, say through the media, right, or something. So that's where a lot of times you're getting your opinions about an area, opinions about a group of people, before you have a face-to-face introduction. But perhaps what you've seen through news or through stories, that starts to develop your opinion or your experience without ever having a personal experience. You start thinking you know a lot about an area or people just based on, perhaps what you see or hear in the news or in the newspapers. So that forms our opinions before you even have an opportunity to have a face-to-face or person-to-person interaction.
Right, absolutely. So if you hear about gun violence in a certain city, then that can very much impact someone's view of that place, right, of that city, and that sense of safety. And people will often make remarks about, about Hartford and about certain towns or cities that have some violence or have some gang-related activity, but these things can occur anywhere, right? So it's not just a limitation, and oftentimes that's one of the first things that people think about when they hear some of the towns or cities in Connecticut is like, is it safe? And but but like I said, there is sometimes that bias and that judgment about and some of that information comes from, and that is a type of bias where it comes from over relying on information. So when we hear things and when we hear stuff from the media, that can have so much weight on what we think about a situation or about a place or a person that can cloud any sort of judgment, and it can be like, well, I heard it on the news, so this is what's real, right? And that's not always the case, right? So, yeah.
So would you also say that it's a lot of time because people don't think, or we don't think about what we're hearing or saying that leads to these biases?
Yeah, it definitely can. And sometimes it has to do with our own experiences or lack of experience, right? So it can be from our own geographical location, what we have exposure to, what kind of people we meet, who we meet, how we process things, and also, yeah, like the information that we get before and after we meet someone or during our interactions, right? So, so it can be from I think it comes from a lot of different places. I've been doing a lot of research on bias and implicit bias, and sometimes implicit bias is really when it's unintentional and we're unaware of it. And so that really could be from, we pick up information that throughout our lives, especially when we're younger with our kids now, like, and our teenagers, they often will pick up information that they're not even realizing what they're saying, right? And sometimes even like, doing a lot of LGBT work as well, I sometimes will challenge people to say like, oh, well, if they'll say like, that's gay, or I don't believe in that, or like I heard that like that it's or I know that it's like, once, if you're born a boy, then you're born a boy, right? But if you ask someone to get into that, or like where they heard that, like how is that true, and where did you get that information, and why is it not okay, it's really hard to come up with an answer for that. But that sometimes comes from a bias of what we learn about gender, what we learn about sexuality, and what we learn about people is that we often learn things about how we're supposed to act based on the biology of our body, right? So it's really fascinating to me to dissect that a little bit, because of the fact that it's really learned more than anything, right? So there's a lot of research that supports the idea that babies and infants are not born with bias and with discrimination and with judgment and with racism. It's more learned, right? So that's an interesting way to look at it. Is, what are we reinforcing with our kids and our young people, and where do they get information from?
How do we change that?
I think a lot of it is education and really having conversations like this, because what I'm learning too is throughout my work as a therapist and I did some coaching training, and I've done a lot of facilitation training, and one of the most powerful things is to have open conversations and for people to learn how these issues like bias and judgment impacts people on a micro level, on a personal level, right? So it's really important to get into the schools, to talk to kids, to talk to teachers, to make sure that, the parts of our communities have policies in place that protect people, that really look at our own stuff. So I think it starts with all of us in this room, and it starts with us really doing a self-inventory of what our judgments are and what our biases are, right? Because no one's immune from it. Like I catch myself sometimes having these thoughts or judgments, and I'm like, whoa, like back that train up. Like, that's not what you do. That's not who you are. Sometimes it's just like I get caught on a bad day or a bad moment, or I'm just, there's my own stuff going on. And I really have to be aware and catch myself. And the good thing is that I think emotional intelligence and social intelligence and the ability to have insight can be learned, right? So a lot of these things that we're talking about can be learned and unlearned, and it's important to really, to be okay with the fact that we're not all perfect, and that like we all have our own stuff that we need to work on in terms of bias and our own judgments and how we treat other people, because it's not about malice or intentions most of the time. It's really just about sometimes we believe or say things or react in a way that isn't who we are or represent who we are, but more so what we're learning. And I think getting in front of kids, going back to your question, was getting in front of kids, having conversations like this, getting more people involved, opening up that door to really talk about, have an honest conversation and really be open to the fact that we need to understand each other more. And it's not about being right or wrong. The human ego is a really, really powerful part of who we are. So a lot of times, we want to be right just because we want to be right, right? So it definitely is like sometimes it's really not about making your point valid or invalidating someone else. It's really about understanding that we all have our own stuff, we all have our own experiences, and I think it's also being aware of your own. I think privilege is also a part of this conversation. So, being aware of the privilege that you have and the privilege that you don't have, right? So sometimes those things can be at both ends of the spectrum, right? So, I mean, as a gay male, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that happened throughout my life that was challenging, but I'm also, I have to acknowledge the fact that I'm a white cisgendered male who has a master's degree, so I have a lot of education. I've had a lot of opportunities. So those two things don't always go together. There's been a lot of discrimination, a lot of things I had to prove to people because of my past, or because of who I am rather. But I have to acknowledge and own the parts that have served me, and that there is privilege there. Like there's people in the world, and I think when I was working in Hartford, and I was working doing in-home programs and working with people in severe poverty, I really started to notice that, like having a checking account, right, is having access to a bank, having access to credit cards, having a gym membership, right? Like being able to drive yourself to a grocery store and buy fresh food. Like, I remember working with a young person one time, and they had never been to Wendy's, right? So like, I mean, Wendy's, right? And that like blew my mind. I was like, wait, okay, so we're going to Wendy's, like, so those, yeah, so we don't realize the things that we have in life because it's a normal part of who we are, right? And so having a car, having access to getting a car, being able to go to driver's ed, being able to get a license, some people don't, having to rely on public transportation, having limited options in terms of health insurance. Like, yeah, you can get on state health insurance, but a lot of places won't take it. There's a lot of dentists that don't take Husky. There's a lot of primary care physicians that won't take it. And even some therapists won't take it. So I think being really honest about that is important. So I'll open it up too for comments. And
this made me think when you talked about someone not going to Wendy's,
yeah,
but in that individual's, perhaps in their world, that's normal. Probably a whole bunch of people around where that individual's from is not going to Wendy's. And so
right.
Once you gain, I guess you gain a little bit of exposure, as you're saying, maybe from your perspective, or you see the world from other people's eyes, it helps you to I guess hopefully not to, I don't know, be so, I guess maybe judgmental, but when you're in the midst of a situation, so if you live in, you know, whatever town who you're around is who you're around.
Yeah.
And that's just normal to you.
Right.
You don't think twice about it. You know, this is what we do. This is how we do it, you know, and then sometimes it gets you in trouble with the law. Like you're asking, well, what did I do wrong? Right? This is what we do every single day, like all the time. Why is this such a problem? But I guess sometimes it deals with, you know, issues. How do we have exposure, you know, to the way, you know, people live? You know, it's not necessarily what's better, what's worse, but it's understand that people are different.
Right.
You know? And I think we get a big, you know, gets us into just a lot of just issues, disagreement, because sometimes I understand that people, we're all different areas, different, you know, beliefs, different likes, different, you know, and this would happen. So we just need to keep working on that type of exposure.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really good way of putting it. I think that exposure and experience of being around other people and that are different than you, and understanding that we are different and we come from different places, but the human experience is quite hard sometimes, right? So adulting is really hard, super hard sometimes, and so we have to make hard decisions, and being a teenager these days is not fun. I think I saw a young person somewhere, but yeah, so it's not a good time, right? It's really challenging. So yeah, so I think that exposure can connect us more.
So I work in the schools, and so
Yep.
we're doing, learning more about even the systems that are in place that give people privilege and that are discriminated against. And I think being able just to kind of take a look at, we were talking a lot about like the GI Bill and redlining and mortgages and where people live and the opportunities that you get and how you can build wealth, and then that wealth can either be passed on or not passed on. A house can be worth $20,000 if it's in one area, and it can be worth $300,000 if it's another area.
Yep.
And so again, just being aware of that, because I think sometimes because we just say, oh, I'm not racist or I'm not biased, I don't have this because I don't live it in my everyday life, there are systems in place that create that. And if you don't know it, then you can take a look at somebody and say, well, I worked really hard, or my father worked really hard to put me in things in an education, and I had to work hard and I earned this. Why? You have that same opportunity, but the starting points were very different. And if you don't know that and realize that, you can make some judgments that are really unfair.
Yeah, thank you. And I pulled this slide up because that reminded me of the concept of intersectionalities, right? So we have so many different components of our identity and who we are, and sometimes those can be invisible and sometimes they can be visible, right? So I think people's experiences can make a huge difference in terms of what they go through and what their experiences are. So if you think about, if you have a kid in foster care, right? If you have a young person or a child in foster care, and what their experience is like with DCF, and what their experience like is within that system can really shape how they see people. So I see it all the time with people that come into treatment and they had a really negative experience with a therapist, and that really makes an impact, and it sometimes can damage people. If they have a negative experience at school or something happens, that shapes all the other systems, like you said, around them, right? So I think it's really important to be aware that the different parts of who we are sometimes can really be, can intersect with each other and can really play a huge part in who we are. So if you have some young folks or a family that comes into your town from, let's say that moves into a town that's from Hartford or Bridgeport or New Haven, right? And they come to Simsbury, and what is that experience going to be like? There's some culture shock there, right? And so I think there's this bubble sometimes that communities have when we think about how things might be different. Like each community, each town, Connecticut is completely different than the other one, right? So, but people's experiences often intersect with so many parts of who we are. So, yeah. And
Yeah, I was going to make a comment. So first of all, I'm actually not from Simsbury. I brought my daughter here. We're from Avon. But I think a big piece of bias is definitions of what's good or bad, what's positive or negative. And different people will have, depending upon where you come from, you're going to have different opinions that will then color your judgment. So I'll give an example, and it's kind of a joke. We're a family, we're Dominican and we're English, right? And we go to the Dominican Republic a lot, but we're traveling around here in Connecticut, and I was with my kids and their friends, and we went down to the beach at Westport, Connecticut, right? And in Westport, Connecticut, there's like a noise, what's it called? A noise restrictions at the beach, right? So you can't be playing music above a certain volume. It seemed really quiet and really boring. I mean, they're teenagers, but we were all joking, and it was like if we were in the Dominican Republic or we were somewhere else, there'd be a fine because it was too quiet, right? Because it's just a totally different culture. So it's really complex, right? It's not just right or wrong, it's your definition of right or wrong from where you come from.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm curious as how as adults, and I know this will happen differently with children, but as adults, how do we stop that knee-jerk reaction that people have? And I'm sure, like Lieutenant Fred could tell us, people see somebody in their neighborhood who does not have the same color skin that they do, and they call the police, and that person is just walking down the street, or they live there, and they haven't been introduced to you yet, but they're your neighbor, and yet there is that reaction. And I don't think there's anybody who was, I'm a racist, so nobody's going to say that, but they have been conditioned to only see certain people walking down the street, and when somebody looks different, they're going to make that call. That's not the right thing to do.
Do we have some?
So as
go ahead.
adults, how do we deal with? And I'm probably not the right person to speak to this, but it happens,
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you going to respond to that before?
No, go ahead. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for volunteering to be the mic guy too. If you need a break, let me know. We'll rotate. Go.
Oh, I'm not an adult. I'm a teenager.
I gave you a shout out, but you weren't in the room, so.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Like you said that like bias is like human nature.
Yeah.
So you're gonna have biased thoughts and stuff like that. But it's the difference of you having biased thoughts and like you said, you had biased thoughts, but then you thought about it and you're like, oh wait, no, don't do that. So it's like you will have biased thoughts, but if like someone calls you out on them, it's like having the conversation but actually listening to the conversation and like thinking through your head. So that's what needs to happen,
Okay.
And
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead. Was that it? Yeah. That was great, thank you. Yeah.
So to even add to that, I think part of it is just what you were saying is, as adults, I think we have to be more open to hearing ourselves, listening to ourselves, and sometimes maybe even, you did that stop, but ask ourselves the question, just ask ourselves the question that if I were someone else, if I was white, and this happened, or how would I feel if that? And I think if we start asking ourselves the question a little bit more often, I think we'll be more cognizant of it.
Yeah.
And I think that's how change happens. I think when we talk about young people versus adults, I don't think the young folks have the issue. I think the adults have the issue. And I think the adults have the issue because we are not as open to just having conversation and understanding that through conversation and communication is how we understand each other more and we learn about each other more.
Yeah.
But we got to just be open and, open enough to just say, Cheryl, tell me a little bit about yourself. Help me to understand how you may have grown up versus me, or why you may like something and I don't. And you can start with the simplest little things. It doesn't have to be the difficult conversations. It can be the little things,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you don't mind going back there, thank you.
Earlier I mentioned that I've been here for about 4 years in Simsbury. And I noticed that one of the first questions I was asked, so I'm from Bridgeport, born and raised, I'm Puerto Rican. One of the first questions I was asked for people to get to know me was, oh, nice to meet you. Do you live in a house or an apartment? And I've probably gotten that question maybe about 5 times in the 4 years I've lived here.
Wow.
And I got so sick of it that I started to dish it right back. Oh, do you live in a house and an apartment? And then their face is like, how dare you ask me that? It's like,
Right.
and I'm like, in my head, I'm like, exactly. Like, nobody goes around asking people that. Like, what are you trying to get out of by asking me that? Are you trying to figure out how I made it here? Another question is, you've never had a real Christmas tree? No, I've had fake Christmas trees all my life. I've never had a real Christmas tree. No, in Bridgeport, we just don't. I don't know. Another question is, you've never gone skiing? No, again, no, there's no mountains in Bridgeport. I've never gone skiing. Literally, at the age of 33, I probably went sledding for the first time in Simsbury Farms, like 2 years ago, a year ago. And it's just, like you said, that like that person that's never been to Wendy's, like these things really do happen in our own backyards. And it's strange. I started to really think like, wow, these people here really do live in a bubble, which it's not something I, of course promote, but it was something I was like telling myself, like, how come these people are asking me these questions and they're so blunt about it? And, remember I was at the bar one day and I figured after school, I go to Tunx's Community College. I'm a full-time student. I figured I'd go to the bar and have a drink, eat something after school. And I started speaking to the couple next to me and I told them, oh yeah, I'm a full-time student at Tunx's Community College. And they laughed and they said, oh, that's like community service, right? And I'm like, what's going on here? Did I move out here to give my children better only to face different problems? Which actually that's what it is. It's just different problems.
Right.
And it's problems I've never been exposed to growing up. Everyone around, I lived in pretty much little Puerto Rico in Bridgeport.
Yeah.
We all cooked the same thing. We all danced to the same music. And so just a little experience from me as a minority in Bridgeport, in Simsbury. Sorry.
Yeah. I just want to thank you. And I want to say too that I think it's really important to help people understand and our kids and our community members understand that our experiences are not everyone's experiences, right? And that's eloquently what you said. But I think it's important important message to reinforce is that we all have different experiences, and that depends on our own intersections, right, of our lives and where we live and what our family and heritage and culture is like in our community. But that's part of this assumption, and it really can isolate people. It can make people feel like there's something wrong with them because they've never been skiing, or they've never done certain things. And so it's not intentional, I think, that people ask those questions inappropriately, but they do it because like that their experience is that people live in houses, right? And so it really, but thank you. Go ahead.
I think your statement, their experience is that people live in houses. it challenges their question because if they're asking, do you live in a house or an apartment?
Right.
They're making an assumption.
Right.
And I guess one of the questions that I would ask you, and I don't know if anyone else want to, you just shared yours. What are some of the results and the effects of implicit bias and bias in general?
Okay. That's a really great question. I'm super glad you're here. Like, this is great.
I feel like one of the worst side effects is like racism that the person doesn't even know they have. It's like, how could I be racist if I have like a black friend or something like that? It's like, you just like that person. Like,
Right.
that's like the worst type to me. And the worst thing is that the person wouldn't like call them out on it, where they can actually have like an impact on how they think. It's bias that like it's like with the person that they're making intentionally, and it's like it's and I see that every single day too.
Does anyone else want to comment on that?
Of implicit or direct bias?
Yeah.
I'll just kind of echo like what she just said. Saying that you have friends or you know individuals that are gay or lesbian or transgender, then it's okay that you don't have a problem with it until it's actually in your family and you have to deal with it. That's really hard. So are you really okay with it or not okay with it? In a situation like that where outwardly you express that you are fine with it until it's actually in your own home.
Yeah.
I think the effects of implicit bias for the person who's on the receiving end, as we just heard several stories of it, it's not just a one-time instance. So you've heard of death by 1,000 cuts, right? There's just a lot of little things that individual is treated differently, is spoken to differently, is not included as often, or is not greeted the same way as everyone else is greeted. And all those things add up to, they're hurtful, and they give that other person less of a sense of worth. And I think that is one of the effects of implicit bias. I think the effect on the person who might be having that implicit bias is they're missing out. They're missing out on the wonderful chance to learn and have a relationship with someone who's different than themselves. They're missing out on that.
Yeah.
Thank you. How about medical treatment? Do you think implicit bias affects the way different people get medical care?
Yep. Yeah.
There's the whole saying that, zip code matters. So where I live can dictate the type of treatment I get.
Mm-hmm.
I live in Avon or Simsbury, versus where I live in Hartford.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Yep. Yeah, I think that access to care, discrimination, what future options, careers, access to education, right? So if you think about the lottery system that the Greater Hartford magnet school system has, right? So it's by chance for a lot of kids in Hartford what school they go to and what level of education they receive based on numbers and if they have siblings already in that system. And so there's a lot of factors to that, but there are kids that that end up getting an equitable education just based on pure luck and what's within their options. Yeah, we had to.
That I feel really strongly about.
Yeah.
So there is an implicit bias in what you said, that the education is better in the suburbs than in Hartford, right? And so my kids are mixed race. We live in Avon. the open choice kids are at our house all the time. I hear what's going on with them. And if you look at the statistics of how these kids are performing, it's hard to argue that they're performing better in our own schools than they would in the Hartford schools. And I think a big reason behind that is because they're not supported, they're not understood, there's huge bias against them, and they don't feel welcome. And it is our jobs to change that, because we are doing not only them a disservice, we're doing our own children a disservice, and we are just reinforcing those biases. So I just really need to examine that assumption, and I'm not,
Right. Well, so I just want to clarify. I may have misspoken. I meant.
I'm not going after you.
Oh, no. Yeah. Yeah. I understand. Yeah. And I may have misspoken because I meant more so with kids in Hartford that end up at community schools, and that rather than magnet schools, because there's a lot of kids in Hartford specifically. But I think other cities may have similar lotteries, but sometimes there's different resources for different schools within Hartford, and that's what I was saying more so. But that more piece of it is more of the lottery piece. So I'm sorry if that came across differently. Sometimes, I can own that I may have miscommunicated that, but I meant more so the different levels of schooling, because the community school has different resources and access to resources than, let's say, a magnet school does that might be in the same neighborhood. Yeah.
Because they're just these automatic assumptions. And another big piece of all of this is stress, right? We know that stress causes illness, it causes absences and all of that.
Yeah.
When you're not welcome in your community, you might be much better off in that neighborhood because your family,
Yeah.
So it's a really important conversation to be having around, on the state level too, around the whole education system.
Yeah.
Supportive education and all of this stuff.
Yeah. There's a lot of.
We really have to challenge some assumptions.
Absolutely. And like I was saying earlier, we all have them and it comes up, and it's not about intention most of the time, but there are a lot of, I think, things within our educational system in Connecticut specifically that we do need to look at, and some of that is the inequities and the assumptions that go along with that, and what that really looks like, and what individuals and families have access to, because there is a zip code sort of thing that happens, right? So I'm not sure exactly what you said, but I liked it. But there's a zip code factor there, right? So I think that's safe to say that plays a part in it. Yeah.
Okay, hi.
Yeah.
Just I want to share a few comments about everything I'm hearing, and I'm looking at intersectionality, and I'm thinking sort of a different sort of intersectionality with respect to bias. And I'm thinking about the way that fear and ignorance and certain levels of conditioning kind of converge to create bias, right? That there's certain assumptions that are generated and negative judgments that can be generated this way out of that combination. And I also want to just acknowledge, because questions have popped up about, well, what do we do about this, right? How do we respond to this? And I loved your answer about asking questions, right? And engaging in meaningful conversation. And so I think, one crucial ingredient about solution is being genuinely curious. Because I think we're really, in a way, talking about reversing a process by which, someone or some group has kind of become dehumanized. And we want to move towards rehumanizing, so that there's a real recognition that, you and I are like full human beings and nothing less than that, And just to that point, if you want to see how that happens, there's a terrific documentary, some of you may know it, called White Right. And it's a documentary about white supremacy, and the woman who does the documentary, she's kind of a journalist, young woman of color, but even though she's a journalist, she's like a therapist throughout this, and she masterfully uses curiosity and learning about these guys who are initially easy to be repulsed by, because they're white supremacist kind of ideology. But it's a fascinating kind of view of how this transformation can actually happen.
Yeah.
So that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's and I'll see if I can find it. There's a quote from Paulo Coelho, and he talks about the process of undoing, right? So it's unlearning, unlearning the things that hold us back, the beliefs, the biases, the judgments. So I think that there is that ability that we have to unlearn things, but it does require, accountability and the willingness and the openness to look at your own stuff, right? So we all have stuff, like I call it my stuff, your stuff, our stuff, right? We all have it, but it's really hard to look at that sometimes and to be open about that. But I think we are capable of it, and it's hard to let go of that ego sometimes, like I said earlier, but that's really important, is to put that guard down. So but I think curiosity is a good way to start.
A couple of things that as I'm listening to everyone, that I thought of is implicit bias, and bias is a lot of times a result of making rash conclusions about people. Mm-hmm. So if we're willing to fight the first impressions we have of people at times, and jump to the other side, okay, I have this impression of this person. What if I think this other way about this person? How will that change how I interact, how I treat, how I deal with this person? And, part of it is, we talk about awareness, is making ourselves aware that we all have biases. So if I'm willing to admit that I have a bias or have biases, how then will I go about, and am I willing to then say, okay, I need to challenge my assumptions, and I might end up still being in the same place, but if I go through that whole process of evaluating what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, I might find myself ending up in a different place where I'm better able to interact and deal with people in a much more positive light.
I'm sorry to do this, but I just want to piggyback off of what you just said. And this is coming from a youth perspective.
Yeah.
It's that you're talking about curiosity and making mistakes and owning your mistakes and stuff like that. And that's basically what you tell teenagers today, right? So this is what I'm saying, is that when did it stop for you guys of being a teenager and being curious and having all these things? Because if you guys were still had these kid qualities, I feel like the world would be a lot more different and stuff. So I just see parents or adults acting this way, and I'm what happened to you for you to just go from
All right, I'm gonna have to respond to that one. On multiple levels. As a parent, much as I would like my kids to make mistakes, and as a black man with black kids, I can't afford that. There's no second chance. So with that, it is good. We want our kids to make mistakes because that's how they learn, that's how they grow. But a lot of times for some kids, when they make a mistake, they pay for it the rest of their lives. And so while we want to do that, we can't always give everyone that opportunity because some people don't get that chance. So don't disagree with you, but I also have to throw in another aspect of how the reality of, and that's oftentimes because of bias within our society, within different and so many different areas of our society.
I was going to add on to that, just real quickly on that. So for everyone that's here, that was just some insight into, as African Americans, and how we're raised, and why it's often thought that we're harder on our kids, okay? And I'm going to just say this because I've been in mixed company, and folks will say, as African Americans, we're much harder on, and the reason why is because they get one chance. They get one chance. And if they mess up, that's it, And it's and to your point about bias, it's, a black kid can do one thing, a white kid can do the same thing, but they'll be treated differently. And so that's why we have to be harder on them. Just wondered.
To go back to that, I wasn't really talking about like making mistakes and stuff like that. I was talking about like when you're in school and stuff like that, you're so open to like learning about new things and stuff like that. So what my thing is like, when does that stop for like adults and stuff like that? And I like.
When it stops, what really does it, because you're right about that. If we all had childlike, and that's what she's saying.
Yeah.
For us to be childlike, and children are just curious. They don't think about it. They just, go up and say, hi.
Yeah.
They don't care what color you are.
Yeah.
But what happens is things happen to us as we get older. And you hold on sometimes to those circles or whatever they may be.
Yeah.
And they cause you to be a little bit more careful, less curious, it's life. That's what it's called. In all honesty. But,
Yeah.
but to her point, how do we change this? We can be more childlike.
And
That really is.
Yeah.
and the one thing about being childlike is that children are curious, and they'll go up and they'll say, hey, he's got dark skin. And it's just an observation that they're making. There's no value that's assigned to it. But as people get older, those kids are then taught that there's value to a lighter skin than to a darker skin. And then when those statements are made, then there's a value attached to it which diminishes the darker skin. And that's how the biases gets perpetuated, and people get treated unfairly.
So there are a couple things that I just want to touch on. Like part of it you said about if a black kid did one thing and it get penalized one way and a white kid could get penalized a completely different way. It even happens, sad to say, within our school system. So my son came home the other day and he was talking to me about, well, of course you see I'm black, but his friend also was black. And so he said to me, oh, so-and-so did X, Y, and Z, and you know that this is what he got as a consequence for it. If that was me, they would not have given me that same type of or level of consequence that this kid had. And I was like, well, why do you think that is? Because you guys are both black, so it really doesn't matter. And so he was like, yeah, because he's from Hartford, that's why he got it tougher than I would have gotten it. I'm not going to say his name because some teachers are here in schools. But just to say that stuff, it happens even in our school district within how geographically where kids are living. The other thing about us being tough on our kids, so my oldest son is 25 years old, and he had some challenges when he was younger, and I was tough on him also, and rightfully so, because a lot of his friends are not alive today. They were either died by the streets or just anything. I mean, that took them, or they're incarcerated for a long, and my son is only 25 years old. And so these are friends that he's never going to be able to be with again because they've been lost. So I'm thankful that I was tough on him. We lived in Hartford. He went to school out here in Simsbury, and a lot of the coaches helped him get out of a lot of trouble when he was younger, because he was a good kid. He just got involved with some stuff that he shouldn't have got involved in, and they saw that in him, and I was tough on him also. So thank God the streets weren't able to swallow up my son. But a lot of these kids, that's their reality every day. They have to go back home to this stuff, and then to have to come into school to deal with other BS that, you know what, I'm not ready to deal with this. So I may act out, or I may not do my work, or I may just fall asleep in class because I couldn't sleep at night because there's gunshots outside my bedroom window. Or I get a school assignment where I have to go home and tell me the shape of the moon. Well, there's a lot of brick buildings, so how am I going to be able to see the moon? Right? Little stuff like that we don't think about when we have our curriculum, that what we do out here is easier for us. Like, the moon is so big and bright. When you go into Hartford, you could barely see that moon at all because of everything that's blocking it. So the things that we take advantage of while we are out here, we just need to be mindful that there are kids that come here every day that aren't able to take advantage of that, and we should be willing to offer them those experiences in a way that's intentional, right? That we are thankful that they're coming out here because they get to expose our children to things that they wouldn't be normally exposed to as well. So it's a learning situation for both sides.
One of the most moving stories we heard, and there was a lot of them, at the forum last May, was a young woman, and she was probably at the middle school. Some of you will remember it. And she was a Simsbury resident and an African-American child, and she was in the bus line at school, and she was waiting to get on her bus to go home, as all the elementary school kids do. And a very nice teacher, thinking she was being very helpful, came over to her and tapped her on the shoulder and said, "Honey, the Hartford bus is over there." And she's like, but I live over here. And,
Yeah.
you know, that had stayed, and this had happened a few years before we were hearing it. And I thought, you know, that's the other side. It's, and what you're all saying about the kids who are here to learn is absolutely true. But there's, from an implicit bias point of view, I think it's happening in reverse also. And when my kids were at the high school, I was involved in a lot of activities and stuff, and I sat in the cafeteria one day selling tickets to one event or another and watched the kids interacting with each other. And there was such a stark divide, and it wasn't necessarily black, white, girl, boy, whatever it was the kids who came in from out of town and the kids who did not. And I think we have to think about that when we're, and that was just a piece of implicit bias that was right out there in front of us. And it wasn't until that girl said that I thought about how that looks on the other side, because that didn't happen to me.
Yeah.
Another piece is microaggression. That's another way it's expressed.
Yep.
So there was a movie that I saw this past weekend called The Best of Enemies with Taraji P. Henson, and I think his name is Sam Rockwell. So it's about a Ku Klux Klan president and a civil rights activist who were at odds with each other, and the town had to come together because Durham, that's where it took place, in Durham, and the town, the African American school had caught fire, and they wanted the kids to go to school with the white kids, and the town was completely against it. And so it got all the way down to, I want to say, it got to some court system, whatever court system it was, but even the judge didn't want to touch the case. And so they had a charrette, And that reminded me of what we had here in May, where you have the two opposing sides decide how it's going to happen, and then I don't really want to tell the movie, but you guys really need to see this, really, because I'm good for telling the movie. I'll tell the whole thing, but The Best of Enemies. It's a really, really, really good movie. It's a really good movie, and how this town was able to decide amongst themselves without the help of the judge and the council or whoever they were, whatever they call them down there, but they were able to decide the fate of those black children.
I was just going to say, to Cheryl's point and so many others, that's exactly why groups like this, like Spirit Council, like Equity Council, are so important, right? Because to really look at where are the inequities, because we have them, and then behind them, what are the absolute root causes, so we can get at those root causes. To Meg's point, right, there's a systemic piece of this that allows these stories to continue to happen. So I always look for, where is that spot where we're working on the system and we're also working as individuals to have those conversations, to stop and ask those questions. You know, Lloyd had said before, you know, little kids coming up and, oh, you have dark skin, and the parent going, no, don't ask that, that's rude. And I'm like, ask away, right? I work very closely with the disability community. Parents are, please, come up, ask me questions about my child, to take some of that stigma away and to make the humanness what connects. And I hope we can continue to have hearts that continue to explore and ask those questions, because that's where we come to the humanness in the interactions and make things better.
No, I mean, this is, no. This
Was this your intention to
this was
start
my
all this
intention,
dialogue?
yeah.
That's great.
This is I had talked to Kristen about that earlier. I said, let's see what happens, so.
There's a phrase that I heard once that's really stuck with me, and it's we need to move from unconscious bias to conscious inclusion. And you've all named the ways you can do that. You can, press the pause button and make sure that you're questioning your own assumptions. You can, ask great questions. You can have the curiosity of a child. The other thing I think we need to do is form relationships with people who aren't like you and crash through your own assumptions in that way. But the other thing I think we need to do is we need to give each other permission to call each other on our assumptions. Mm-hmm. And when we do that, we can, because sometimes we don't know what we don't know. We've just ignorant about something that someone else can educate us on if we don't take offense to someone helping to point out to us something that we could learn from and know, and that would help us to be less biased and more consciously inclusive.
Yeah, I just want to say that I want to go back to your question earlier about curiosity and where that escapes. And I think I just wanted to add my piece in that oftentimes I think as adults we become hardened by our experiences and entering into adulthood and having to make, start families and get jobs and trying to, and for some people it's surviving, some people it's, escaping whatever, like escaping their own reality or being the best that they can. And sometimes their circumstances that might be a challenge, right? So, but I think that it is really important to look at our own sort of hardening and what that means and how that affects us, because it's different for each of us. There are our experiences and the losses and the good and the bad and the things that we accomplish and the things that we don't accomplish that really do harden us as we get older. And I think that it's really important to look at that and try to be open-minded to the fact that that's our experiences and our own biases coming into play. But I think, and I'm glad that you asked that question, because it really had me think about the importance of having young people, having people like you in conversations like this, right? And that's really super important. So I think tying this into the community, to young folks and to high school kids, and because they're much more open. And I think someone had said this earlier, like it's not so much the kids and adolescents, it's the adults in the room, right? And I use that a lot. I use that expression a lot because I think we have a lot of stuff to unpack, and sometimes that comes up in our interactions and how we see the world, right? So go ahead.
I don't think that we need to have kids. I think it's vital for kids to be involved in this conversation because, no offense, but like, you guys are going to be older, so all of these issues like climate change and stuff like that are not going to affect you because you guys are either going to be in Florida or like not here anymore. So like we're the ones that are left to pick up basically your mess, and I just don't really want to do that. So I feel like we have to involve kids now because we're going to be the ones that are doing this stuff later. Yeah. And it's better to like face the problem before like you're reacting to the problem like after it happens.
So you're going to bring 2 friends next time.
Yeah.
Older, so you guys have like the reason of like I just don't care, like, you know, it's like we're gonna be 25 and we have to care. That's what we have to like.
I think there's something that I wanted to add that had what you said had prompted that for me. Something that I'm working on personally and professionally is this concept of reacting to what's happening to me versus responding to what's happening to me, right?
Yes.
So it's really important to really think about and to teach and to like look at that for ourselves and teach that to our families and everyone in our community, that we have to really think about, okay, I feel some sort of way, I got triggered, right? There's something happening for me. What is it that's happening and how do I respond? Because you know, there's a lot of things that we have shared in this room that really you're completely valid for wanting to go ham on people, right? Or to be upset and be angry. But when we get to that point, the message gets lost, right? So if we respond with bias and judgment and prejudice with our own anger or frustration or animosity or outrage, it's not that those feelings aren't valid, it's that no one's going to hear them because they're just going to be focused on you sounding like you're a maniac, right? Not you, but just you, meaning anyone. Yeah. So I think that's really important to think about is, you know, how do we really respond to these situations? We have to have dialogue. We have to have a plan. We have to think about these things. We have to really be intentional with how we start to undo these things that are these biases and these things we're talking about tonight, these concepts and these struggles on not only like a micro level, but a macro level, because this is an issue for all of us and in a deeper way. And it stems down from, there's some really systemic things going on that we need to look at. Go ahead.
I think part of the answer to your question that you just posed is having emotional intelligence and 100%. Being able to reflect when on yourself and your feelings when things like that are happening with you and you're in the moment and you're feeling your hair stand up on the back of your neck or your body getting hot. Being able to realize what those triggers are in your body and ask yourself the question, like, why do I really feel this way? Why is this so important to me that I'm feeling this way? Why is this such a hot button to me? Right. Being able to ask yourself those types of questions can then lead you to look at the other person's perspective on what it is that they're saying, so that you're not making it about you, but actually listening to what that person is saying.
Right. And we have some people that work in schools here, right? So how does the emotional intelligence play a role in school right now? Is that something that you can talk about or teach, or? I can speak to that. Because I agree with you 100%. I think it's super important, but I think other things take precedent
Well, I think it has to be explicitly taught, right? And some people have an emotional intelligence innately, and others do not. So one of the things that we're really looking at through our strategic plan, it's our 5-year plan, but it outlines the blueprint of issues that we're talking about right now, around equity, around social emotional learning. Everyone right now has a curriculum, and they're like, hey, this is going to solve all your SEL issues, right? And we want to be more thoughtful about that, and to determine where does it happen, when does it happen, with whom does it happen, because it's just as important as your ELA, your English language arts, and your math, and your science, and your social studies. So it's something that is continuing to evolve because we want to do it right.
Absolutely.
I would suggest that it's perhaps even more important than some of the things you were just talking about. So I'm an old white woman, and I am trying to figure out how in a community that looks like this, are we able to have sufficient exposure ourselves as older adults or as adults to be able to engage in this conversation, because it is multi-generational, but we need to see and to be with and to converse with people who don't look like us and who may not act like us all the time. How is that possible in a community that lacks a maximum amount of, lacks a lot of diversity?
Yeah.
And, that's part of the outreach and the things that we want to do through the Spirit Council to reach within our community. But as I mentioned earlier, well, most of you weren't here, is to reach outside of the Simsbury community to neighboring communities, to interact with them, to do things with those communities so that we can really learn that it's just a person with a different color eye, even though it's like the difference in their skin tone is different. As I was standing here and walking around, one of the things I thought of is, if we could get to that point where we treat each other the way we want to be treated, it would make such a big difference. But there are times when I treat you not like a human being, less than I should, and that has an impact on you and on me and on our community. But if I treat you and everyone the way I want to be treated, our entire community would change. But are we willing to do that? Because, as you said earlier, my ego gets in the way.
Yeah.
And when our ego gets in the way, we all lose.
Yep.
There's no winner.
Right.
I mean, you have to be able to say, yes, I want to treat you the same way that I want to be treated, but that requires me saying, well, that's not happening now. And I think that's where we need to start. I mean, we have to say, okay, here's our issue,
You may have to accept that you're also biased towards yourself as well, and you can't treat yourself the way you want to be treated, let alone anyone else.
Yeah, and I think being really honest and transparent and accepting that you have some biases and that you have things to work on, because we all do. There's some hands up over here too. Yeah.
I also do appreciate it when people start off with, excuse my ignorance, but I really don't know. Like, are Puerto Ricans Americans, let's say, or like if you're going to ask a question that you think might offend someone, it usually helps when you start off, excuse my ignorance. I really don't know, but I would like to know if.
Right.
I was just gonna say too, like, so many moments become teachable, but if it's in a school, then perhaps you might be asking or needing a 14 or a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old, to have the ability, perhaps, to how do I turn a teachable moment, to my teacher, and perhaps to, 20 other kids that don't look like me, that don't think like me. And so it becomes a very daunting and overwhelming task, because these are things that happen on like a day, to day basis. And then when you don't have the ability almost to express it, to explain it, regardless of your social emotion, that's almost not about boldness.
Yeah.
Right? Not everyone possesses that. And as much as we might think people, of color, of anybody, are very outspoken, right? But it's not always an easy thing to speak about. And so a lot of times these moments they keep passing, and then it just, whatever the bias, whatever the stereotype, whatever it may be, it keeps getting just reinforced and reinforced, and it just keeps, going and going. So, and as parents, we come up from Hartford as well, and I'll just say, like, our oldest son was in middle school, and he brought home what was it, To Kill a Mockingbird. I'm like, man, I read this book in middle school, right? And all I'm thinking is that we just had a black president, and I was like, the only image that these kids are still getting from their school on a day-to-day basis is a sharecropper, and it's just like, man, how do we fix this imagery?
Yeah.
Like to work with the biases that are, because it's just being read, it's being discussed, and it's just being absorbed, all over again. So it's just, it's a lot, you take it, one bit, at a time. And then I was just, thinking, sometimes when you come up to Simsbury, and I just kind of wonder, I'll ask the question to myself, like, how much are the kids, how much are the parents, do they meet people of color that are of any influence, that are any impact?
Yeah.
Literally, how is it to realize they could probably literally live their whole life and not have to deal with any person of color of really any literal impact in their entire lives?
Yep.
And so from my experience, whether it's dealing with a teacher, whether it's dealing with the boss, whether it's dealing with a police officer, there's always going to be, in some sense, that interaction that's always there. But what is it like how do you have diversity, right? How do you get rid of these biases when you're literally not having any type of, I think it's kind of mentioned, but there's no,
exposure.
Exposure.
Yeah.
That's why I said that word earlier, but there's literally no bonding. Okay, I know such and such maybe from the basketball team. We played sports together, but there's like literally, you could literally go, I would assume, your whole life without having a person of color of any influence, of any, I don't know, positive impact to teach you, to feed into you, to show you a different way of life, and your whole entire lifetime. And so it's just something that, I was thinking.
Yeah.
I hate to put this off, but it is just after 8 o'clock and the library's going to close on us.
Okay.
So I want to give Shane a chance to wrap up, to tell us, all your words of wisdom.
Okay.
And I just love the fact that we've all gotten engaged in this conversation. And I would love for it to go on forever, but we should definitely do it again.
Yeah. And I think, and I just to echo that, I think it's important to, to continue these conversations and it's vital to get young people involved, right? And it's really important to really, I think, allow is a really strong word, I think, for what we're talking about, like allow these conversations to happen, allow yourself to be curious, allow yourself to self-examine. I think there's one thing I kept thinking of when in our last 10 minutes or so was, do folks here watch This Is Us? Have you folks seen that show? Yeah. So there's This Is Us. Yeah, sorry, I talked fast sometimes. So there's a scene in which Randall, when he's a kid, he was like 9 or 10, and I think you know where I'm going with this already. And he was starting to have some issues at school, and there's a black teacher that was at his private school, and he started really to identify with him, and they built a close bond. And his dad started to really question that and felt uncomfortable with it, and the dad said to him at one point, he's like, when I look at you, Randall, I don't see color, right? So then Randall said, well, then you don't see me, right? So it's important to acknowledge these differences and you know, it's very similar when people say like, well, I don't care if you're gay, or I don't care if you're whatever you are, or whoever you are. It doesn't bother me. It's not about us. It's not about, you know, it's about seeing and acknowledging that person and their struggle, right? Because you can not have an issue, but that doesn't acknowledge the fact that there's a difference and that they're going to be, if they haven't already, be treated differently, right? So it's really important to acknowledge that we can't be colorblind or be, you know, be open as a rainbow. Like, you know, we have to really acknowledge and tell people that we see them for who they are, and we accept them for who they are, and it's not about us, right? So I think I just want to highlight some, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll make this quick, but there's some really good things that came out of this that I wrote down. Some really just quick things like that we talked about. So exposure, right? So one idea is to have panels. We learn firsthand from other people. So having people of color, people who have experienced bias or community trauma, have people come talk to you, talk to your young folks. So because a lot of times we don't have that exposure, and I've met people that have never met someone of color, or kids that have never met someone that was, or only knew white police officers or white teachers, right? So ask questions, be curious, self-evaluate, get clarification too. Like, call people out, but also make sure that you know what they meant by that, right? So get clarification sometimes. Respond versus react, right? And don't be afraid. And I love the curiosity thing. I think that's fantastic. I think, you know, we have to remember that, like, sometimes it's okay to be curious and go back to being that person who you are, because that little kid's inside all of us. We all still have it, but sometimes we just don't let them come out and play. So once in a while, it's okay. All right. So thank you very much. I appreciate everyone being open and talking about stuff and beginning this conversation. So I encourage you all to continue this and really start to think about, how do you implement these ideas and how do you continue this conversation, because it's important. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. For everybody at home, if you are interested in the Community for Care or the Spirit Council, or anybody here who would like to get more involved with those committees, I would encourage you to either contact me or Kristen Cormack, our Director of Social Services. She's our staff liaison. Nicole Kodak is our co-chair of the Spirit Council. We are on the